Thank you everybody for coming out. And I apologize in advance for my English privilege. I've never had to learn another language because the English dominance. I'm going to try to speak quite slowly because I know my accent probably throws some people off. Inevitably though, I'm probably going to speed up and accelerate over the process. So I apologize, and if anybody sort of has trouble understanding me, just raise your hand at any point, and I can go over things. So what I want to talk about today is platform capitalism. And this is material coming from my next book, sort of looking at exactly what are platforms and situating them within the capitalist system. So there's a lot of discussion about platforms right now, but oftentimes they are taken as sort of bearers of cultural values. So you have sort of discussions about Californian ideology and stuff like this. Or they're sort of thought of as being just sort of well-intentioned firms that maybe if we can convince to act in a nice way. And this sort of neglects the fact that they are profit-oriented firms. They are situated within a capitalist system, and therefore they have certain constraints and incentives built into them. And so I want to understand platforms as entities within a capitalist system, hence platform capitalism. So I'll begin with a couple of characterizations of what exactly is the dominant sort of sector in the world today, in the capitalist world today. Now, a lot of people think it's a tech-led world today. And I think this is somewhat problematic because if you look at the other major companies that aren't Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, they're all using technology as well. So you can hardly look at an oil company and say that they're not using and developing technology as well. So I don't think a tech sector is a particularly apt name for what is going on right now. The other aspect is that the tech sector is very small. And we sort of forget this because it seems to just be prevalent everywhere. But by any normal economic statistic, the tech sector is very small, the computer sector. So in the US, it has about 7% of value added, and it employs about 2.5% of the working population. I believe in America, 2% of the population works on farms. So it's about the level of agriculture in America. If you look at the UK, you see a similar sort of thing. The UK is famously a deindustrialized country, but actually manufacturing employs 3 times more than the tech sector in the UK. If we look at Facebook, it employs around 12,000 people. WhatsApp employed around 55 people when it was sold for $1 billion. And Instagram employed 13 people when it was sold. So these tech companies don't employ a lot of people, and they actually don't contribute a lot of value according to traditional economic statistics. So I don't think calling it a tech sector-led economy is the right way to label it. Now, another one is the sharing economy. And this is often used by proponents of things like Uber and Airbnb and Handy. And the idea here is that people are freely sharing goods that they aren't using. So if you've got, a spare room in your house, you can share it out to people. You can provide it to people for a small fee. And this is sort of a dominant ideology today about what is going on with these sorts of platforms here. But actually sharing is meant to be free. You don't normally charge your friends when you share something with them. If you share a pizza with somebody, you don't exactly get them to pay you by the slice. Now, the other aspect is that the sharing economy is premised largely upon mass exploitation of people. So Uber is the best example here. Most Uber drivers make under minimum wage. In London right now, we've just had a massive strike by Deliveroo riders. And these people have just managed to get a minimum wage for themselves as well. The other sort of aspect is that this is not really sharing between individuals. When we look at Airbnb and you look at the statistics about who is actually renting out rooms on Airbnb, it turns out mostly it's landlords who have a few different places, it's large companies, and it's not individuals who just have a spare room in their house. These tend to be the landlord class rather than being any sort of individualistic sharing economy. So I think while the sharing economy is supposed to suggest a nice community-led economy, I think this is very far from what is actually happening in practice. So the sharing economy is not a particularly good label either. It also doesn't really explain what's going on with things like Google, Facebook, and Amazon, which aren't participating in it. Now, a third sort of option here is what's called the gig economy. And this is the idea that over the past 40 years, we've essentially shifted from an economy based upon careers, where you'd work 10, 20, 30 years, to one that's premised upon jobs. And today we're starting to see one that's premised upon tasks. So this is a sort of hyper-precarious employment premised upon single gigs, piecemeal work, and it's epitomized by companies like Uber, Deliveroo, Handy, and also Mechanical Turk. Now the thing is, this sector is rather small as well. So when we talk about it and we present it as being this massive new shift in capitalism, it isn't actually that big of a shift. Now it's hard to get proper figures on this. Nobody has been able to get direct measures of how many employees Uber has or how many people are working in the online sharing economy. But various estimates suggest that it's about 1% of the population, 1% of the US workforce in the US. And about half of that is supposedly Uber alone. So Uber has a massively sort of overestimated size in the gig economy. Now in the UK, it's estimated to be a little bit bigger. It's estimated to be about 3% of the working population. But again, this is an incredibly small number of people. It's not a big thing. Now this is not to deny that work is becoming more and more precarious. We have more and more flexible contracts. We have more and more part-time work. But the gig economy online is a rather small part of it. So I don't think calling it the gig economy names this moment particularly well either. So I want to name it platform capitalism. If we want to talk about what is one of the dominant sort of shifts in capitalism today, it has to do with platforms. And what are platforms? I think platforms are often used in a number of different ways, often in a very sort of confused way. So I want to try and be clear here about what exactly a platform is. Now in the first place, it's a new business model. It's a new way of organizing businesses that is distinct from both the Fordist model and the post-Fordist model as well. So a Fordist model, you can sort of think of Henry Ford and his assembly line producing cars. You've got mass production of the same commodity over and over and over again. You've then got mass consumption, oftentimes by the same workers who are on the assembly line. And you've got a vertical integration where Ford has control not over just the cars, but also over all the parts going into those cars as well. Now that's not a platform. And a platform is also distinct from the post-Fordist model. So a post-Fordist model coming about around in the 1970s was organized around flexible production. The idea here is that you would have a sort of just-in-time supply of parts come to you, and you'd be able to flexibly respond to changing consumer demand and changing supply conditions as well. It was highly premised upon individualized consumption as well. So getting away from mass production and more towards, oh, what would you like in your car? Would you like air conditioning or not? Would you like power windows or not? All of these sorts of things. It's a much more individualized form of production. I think importantly, the post-Fordist model was also a lean business. So the idea was you cut any unprofitable elements out of your business. I think Nike in the 1990s is a great example of this. Nike did not own any shoe manufacturing. It outsourced all of that stuff, and effectively all that it owned was a massive organization for branding, advertising, and getting people to pay large amounts of money for their shoes. So that was a very lean business. They're not producing anything. Now, platforms are different from all of that. And I think if I was going to summarize it, platforms are intermediaries and they're infrastructures. And sort of picks up on both of these aspects typically. Now, they're intermediaries in the first place between different groups. So they're intermediaries, they bring together buyers, sellers, advertisers, users, developers, riders, etc. If you know the economics literature on this, it goes by the term multi-sided market. But this is effectively the idea that Facebook, for instance, is bringing consumers and advertisers together onto its platform to exchange goods and services. Now, platforms are also infrastructures, and they're effectively an infrastructure for an interaction between all of these groups that are being brought together. So we can think about Uber, for instance. Uber is an infrastructure for drivers and people who want to be picked up and have a taxi ride. It's an infrastructure for them to come together and to interact and exchange services. So this is what a platform is. It's an intermediary and it's an infrastructure. Now, as an infrastructure, it also allows these groups to build things on top of them. So a good example of this is building apps on the App Store, building software for an operating system, building video games for a console. All of this is an example of providing the infrastructure and then allowing people to develop on top of it. Now, one thing I think that's interesting about this definition is that it actually excludes a major company that we think of as being part of this sort of massive shift, and that's Apple. Apple is primarily not a platform company. Apple makes about 68% of its revenue just from iPhone sales. And I think actually Apple is much more akin to Nike in the 1990s, a sort of luxury goods company that's premised upon branding rather than anything else. I don't think Apple is actually all that interesting of a company. They're quite traditional. Now, they do have platform aspects. iTunes and the App Store are platforms, but Apple doesn't make much money from them. Okay, so we have some idea of what platforms are. Now, they come with a few characteristics as well. One of these is network effects. And I think if you want to understand the nature of the contemporary economy, you need to know what a network effect is. Effectively, the idea of a network effect is that the more people who use a platform, the more valuable that platform becomes for everyone else. So you think about it, for instance, if you want to join a social media site, you may hate Facebook, but you know everybody else is on Facebook, and so you join it anyways. So the more people who join it, the more likely other people are to join it. And this leads to a tendency towards monopolies. So Facebook is, without a doubt, the monopoly for social networks. Google is, without a doubt, the monopoly for search engines. And I was telling this story last night about a story which may or may not be true, but I like to believe it's true. Apparently, the #1 search term on Bing is Google. But this is a good example of network effects. Now, a second aspect of platforms is what's called cross-subsidization. And this is a very fancy word, but it quite simply means the fact that Google will provide you with free email, it subsidizes that free email, but then it charges other people, namely advertisers, in order to make up for that cost. So this is quite interesting, because this is very different from the post-Fortis model. The post-Fortis model would say, cut out any unprofitable aspects of the company. Whereas a platform has to bring all these people on board, which means that it has to cross-subsidize its company. So certain arms of a platform are subsidized, while other arms have their prices raised. And the idea is that you try and balance all of this out in order to get more users on board and initiate network effects so you can build yourself a monopoly. This is the entire sort of strategy of platforms. Now, another aspect here, the final aspect I want to talk about, is effectively that platforms have a sort of designed core architecture. And this means that platform intermediation is not neutral. It's not an empty space when riders and drivers come together on Uber. It's not an empty space when people come together on Facebook. And this means that platforms intrinsically contain a politics. And I think this should be a major focus of research, is completely understanding exactly the sort of politics that is involved and embedded within platforms. So let me give one quick example here. Uber presents more drivers on its screen than are actually available. So if you ever load up the Uber app and you see all these little cars showing up on your screen, there's actually not that many cars around. So it shows that there's more supply than there actually is. Likewise, it has this thing called surge pricing, where it raises the cost of traveling around at particular times in particular places. And this effectively means that for drivers, it suggests that there's more demand for them at that point. But this is entirely artificially created by Uber. It's the politics of the platform. They're manipulating supply and demand in order to try and get more users on board. And likewise, Facebook is another good example. It only allows certain actions on its platform. It only allows certain content on its platform. You can only do certain things on it. And this is entirely about the politics of the platform. Okay, so this is platforms. Why are they important? Why are they crucial to understanding the contemporary economy? Well, I think the simple reason is, as intermediaries and as infrastructures, platforms are positioned to capture and control as much data as possible. Effectively, what they are doing is drawing in all of this activity into their online platform and then having people interact on it and recording every single action that goes on within that platform. So if capitalism today is premised upon data extraction and data collection, platforms are effectively the ideal way to do that. And this is why you see not just Google and Amazon and Facebook acting as platforms. This is why you see Monsanto and John Deere and GE and Siemens building platforms. All of these companies, these traditional industrial powerhouses, are all becoming platforms. And it's because of this, I think, because data is central to today, and the platform is the ideal way to extract data. Okay, now I want to talk now about different types of platforms, because I think oftentimes we talk about platforms as being one singular unique thing, and that the sort of dynamics of platforms hold for all of them equally. I don't think this is actually the case. And so I've tried to draw up in my book a number of analytical distinctions between different types of platforms. And this is particularly premised upon how do they generate revenue? What is their profit source? And I think this is a crucial sort of Marxist way of understanding platforms in contemporary capitalism. So these are the 5 categories here. I'm going to go through each one in turn. Any given company can participate in a number of these. So Amazon, for instance, involves cloud, product, lean, and advertising platforms. Google, for instance, involves advertising, cloud platforms. It participates in a bunch of these at once. But I think these analytical distinctions are important for understanding what the sort of constraints and incentives are on these companies, and then what the likelihood of their survival is. And this is one of the questions I want to face in the end is, can they generate profit? Can they survive in a capitalist economy? And if so, what do they need to do to become profitable? So I'll begin here with advertising platforms. So this is Google and Facebook. The blue is the amount of revenue that they get from advertising. The red is revenue from other sources. So for Google, it is 89%. For Facebook, it is 96% of their revenue comes from advertising. These are effectively advertising companies, which means that they are highly dependent upon the advertising industry as a result. And the idea here is that what they do is they extract data from their users, they work on that data, and then they sell ad space. And I think this is important because they don't sell data. And I think it's partially a mistake to maybe think of data as a commodity, because what they do is they use algorithms to match users with advertisers without actually giving data to the advertisers. And I think that's an important nuance that's often lost. Now, the imperative for an advertising platform is that they have to expand their data collection. If they want to compete against each other, if they want to get advertising money, they have to get more and more data on us as a result. And so this is what you can expect from these sort of advertising platforms, is a constant drive to get more and more data from us, to create little behavioral nudges on Facebook, for instance, that force you to, or compel you to put more information online, to develop new services, which mean that you stay on Facebook for longer or you use Google more. And what this also means is that the sort of concerns about privacy are always going to take a backseat to these platforms. I think it's quite interesting when you look at the sort of privacy outbursts that happen around Google and around Facebook. is that oftentimes they will just go and do something, and then they'll roll it back if there's an outcry. But I think this is fundamental to their very business model, is that they have to be doing this. They have to be pushing the edges of privacy constantly in order to be able to survive within capitalism. So this is the main driver of an advertising platform. Now, the second platform here is cloud platforms. Two big examples today, Amazon Web Services and Salesforce. And cloud platforms effectively provide the hardware, the development tools, and the software for other companies to use. And their profit is entirely dependent upon renting out their platform to other companies. So one good example is Uber. Uber owns very little in terms of assets. It rents most of its stuff from Amazon Web Services and from a number of other different cloud platforms. And Uber is a very sort of what I'm going to call a lean platform, which I'll get to in a bit. Now, cloud platforms are rapidly becoming a huge part of the platform economy. They are already, Amazon Web Services is already the most profitable element of Amazon. Google is moving into this area right now. So all of the very sophisticated sort of machine learning algorithms that Google has, they're now making available to rent. So if you want image recognition algorithms, for instance, Google is making this available as a sort of cloud-based platform. Microsoft is currently developing artificial intelligence, which will then be rented out as a cloud-based platform. And IBM is sort of speculatively working on quantum cloud computing as we speak. But basically what you see is every major company moving into the provision of cloud platforms to some degree. Amazon is by far the most dominant one right now, which is interesting because we often think of Amazon as being an e-commerce company. It's much more of a cloud platform company today than ever before. Now, a similar thing is what's called industrial platforms. And this is, I'm sure we've all heard of the Internet of Things, the idea that you connect sensors and you connect items in the world up to a sort of local internet or broad internet. And the idea here is that there's also an industrial Internet of Things, which would do the same thing within factories. So sensors and materials and bottles passing down an assembly line, all of these things would be connected to a local internet, the industrial internet. And the idea here is that this will increase productivity, it will lower maintenance costs, so you can have machines warn you that when they're about to break down, and it can also improve flexibility in production. So there's a major chemical company, BASF, which has what it calls a smart factory, where every single bottle coming down the assembly line can be entirely different from the one before it. So rather than having to rechange the entire assembly line, the industrial internet allows them to be incredibly flexible. Now that's interesting and all, but I think the more important part is the platform providers of the industrial internet. So this is effectively cloud-based computing for factories. And you even have people like GE and Siemens talking about providing a sort of app store for a factory. So companies could actually go onto this app store and buy an app for their local internet. Now this is where the real money is in the industrial internet, in the Internet of Things. So GE and Siemens are currently fighting right now to have the dominant platform for the industrial Internet of Things. And if you remember, network effects are crucial to these sorts of things. So both of them are trying to get the monopoly position within this industry. Now Siemens has already spent about 4 billion euros on it. GE made last year $5 billion on its cloud-based platform, and it collects more data than Facebook. So GE's cloud-based system is already quite technically sophisticated. And the sector is estimated to be worth about $225 billion by 2020, which I should mention is more than the consumer Internet of Things. So oftentimes we're fascinated by attaching your toilet or your fridge or something to the internet. That's not where the money's at. The money is here with GE and Siemens and their industrial platforms. Okay, now the fourth sort of platform is what I call a product platform. And this effectively transforms goods into services that can be rented. And I think this is very important because this is one of the major ways in which capitalism is actually trying to recuperate free informational goods. So one of the interesting sort of things going on right now is that the music industry has been suffering for about almost 20 years since Napster came out and we all got access to free music. And it's been declining in revenue year over year over year. 2016, the revenues for the music industry are going to increase for the first time in a long time. And this is because they have platforms which are recuperating those free goods into their own sort of platforms where they can rent out music. So things like Spotify, things like iTunes, these are all good examples of platforms recuperating the sort of free aspects of the contemporary economy. Now, one of the most interesting examples, though, has to do with a company I don't think many people would think of, and this is Rolls-Royce. So Rolls-Royce, part of their business is to create jet engines. Now, about 20 years ago, they shifted their business from selling jet engines to airplane manufacturers to renting thrust. And this means that effectively what they do is that they charge the airline by the mile for how much thrust is used. They rent out the jet engines rather than selling them. And what they get in return, the aircraft manufacturers, is they get maintenance on the engines as well. Now what's quite interesting is that Rolls-Royce then uses this as a platform to collect an immense amount of data. So it's constantly collecting maintenance data on all of its jet engines, it's collecting weather data, it's collecting aerodynamic data to make their jet engines better. And this is again producing a network effect, which means that Rolls-Royce is now at the leading edge of jet engine production. So this is a really interesting way in which platforms have completely revolutionized a traditional industry and extracted data in a way that gives them a monopoly position. Now, the final one I want to talk about is one we're probably all quite familiar with. This is lean platforms. And the idea of the lean platform is sort of summarized in this somewhat famous quote now that says, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles, and Airbnb, the largest accommodation provider, owns no hotels. So this is what I mean by lean. Effectively, they own as little as possible. They are virtually assetless companies. And Mackenzie Wark, when he talks about the vectorless class, I think this is sort of what he has in mind. This sort of idea of a company that basically just owns the minimal platform and that's about it. Now, their profitability comes from two different things. One is they outsource costs. So not only does Uber not have to pay benefits and unemployment and healthcare for workers, they also don't have to pay for maintenance costs for the cars, legal costs, fuel costs. So they outsource all of these costs to the individuals outside of the platform. Now, the other way in which they profit is through venture capital welfare. And this is basically the immense amount of money being thrown around at these companies, assuming that they're going to become a monopoly at some point and they can make a profit eventually. But basically, Silicon Valley's venture capital is just supporting these companies is the only thing keeping them afloat. And I think this is a really important part. Most of these companies are not profitable. The vast majority of them are not profitable. Uber is arguably profitable, but Uber, as recently as a month ago, was losing $1 million annually in China to try and fight off his Chinese competitor. So Uber was losing a ton of money. Every other one of these is losing a ton of money. And I think this is important because I think all of these sort of lean platforms are going to die out in the next 5 years. I think what they will do is either they will die out or they will shift to being a luxury service. They'll jack their prices up and it'll be stuff that's only available to people who are relatively wealthy. I don't think these things are, they can't survive within a capitalist economy. So this is the 5 sort of platforms: advertising, cloud, industrial, product, and lean platforms. Each of them faces a different set of constraints, each of them gets its revenue from a different source, and each of them has slightly different dynamics. And I think it's important to always be remembering that when we talk about platform capitalism. Now, I want to talk about 3 possible futures. So where are things going? Now, I think the most likely is what I'm going to describe as monopoly platforms. But there's 2 other sort of alternative options available. But as you'll see, I'm not holding out much hope for either of them. So we'll begin with platform monopolies. And this is basically the idea that network effects mean platforms tend towards a winner-takes-all model. It leads towards monopolies. But now, the necessity of data extraction to these companies, it means that they're structurally driven to continue to expand their data extraction. So I think this makes sense of why Google turned itself into Alphabet. It's because they want to expand into all these different areas where they can also get data. Why would Google ever invest in Nest, a home Internet of Things sort of company? It's completely outside of their normal business range, except Nest provides them with a whole new source of data, and data is central to their business. And if you look at the way in which these companies are developing, and you have to recall, Amazon and Facebook and Google and Microsoft, these are some of the companies who are purchasing other companies at an extremely rapid pace. Google purchases a new company every week. It's an immense amount of companies that they're purchasing precisely in order to get more and more data, to expand their data extraction capacity. Now, I think as these platforms compete against each other, they're going to close each other off. So basically, it's going to be a matter of, if you are on the Facebook platform, you can't share things with the Google platform, and vice versa. And this is one of the ways in which a platform contains users within itself. So it keeps users within its platform, and they don't go to its competitors. So I think the likely future is that we'll see massive, closed, expansive, and monopolistic platforms. And I think these things will continue to buy up not just small companies, but also sort of second-tier platforms as well. So a good example of this is Microsoft spending $26 billion to buy LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is important because it's basically the workers of the global economy changing their jobs, changing their skills, and giving all the data to Microsoft. It is a ground floor of the global economy, and this is why Microsoft spent a huge amount of money to get it. It's a huge amount of data. But this is what we can expect, I think. And I think actually we may have already a sort of good example of this. And this is one that's only come to me recently, but this is WeChat, one of the biggest apps within China, but relatively little known outside of China. And I think that this is possibly the future. It's a closed app, but it enables other apps to work on its platform. So something like Uber can provide its services on WeChat's platform. It's expanded to payments, so you can very easily purchase things on its platform. It's got taxi services, it's got food ordering, you can make a doctor's appointment. It's got all sorts of government services as well, which is interesting because this platform is now taking over traditionally political functions. It's taking over public government functions as well. And then interestingly, its revenues come from e-commerce primarily rather than advertising. Advertising I don't think, is a sustainable business model for Facebook and Google. And this is quite interesting because Google's chief economist, Hal Varian, has even said openly he doesn't think advertising will sustain Google over the long term. He thinks eventually Google will turn to a model where you have to pay to use it, which is quite interesting when you start thinking about the likely changes within these companies. But so I think WeChat is a good model here. It's expanded its data collection across many different areas. It's closed, and it's starting to pick up functions that we normally don't sort of associate with these platforms. This is, I think, the most likely future. And I think, to be honest, I think there's very little we can do to change it. I think this is the way things are going, and I'm not sure that we have the capacity to actually change that dynamic. But let me go through 2 sort of alternative options. One is platform cooperativism. So this is the idea, primarily associated with a guy named Trevor Schultz. It's the idea that platforms are owned, created, and controlled by the workers. So the idea would be that you have a sort of Uber that's created by workers, owned by workers, and then the profits are distributed in a fair and equitable manner. Now the problem is, how do you compete against multi-billion-dollar companies? So Uber is worth $62.5 billion right now. How the hell is any sort of little startup going to compete with that? I don't think it's going to. I think fundamentally the odds are against any sort of platform cooperativism being able to compete against these things. Now it's not just money though, it's also the problem that the amount of data that these things have collected. So the amount of data that Uber has collected, the amount of data that Facebook has collected, but then also the network effects of it. So in France right now, there is a platform cooperativist alternative to Uber. And if you go on the App Store, at least the Android App Store, it has under 1,000 downloads. Basically, nobody's using it. And this is the problem of network effects. Everybody knows Uber, all the drivers are on Uber, all the riders are going to Uber. It's very hard to shift away from that, even if Uber raises up the prices. It has a monopoly position. The other sort of aspect is this sort of hypothetical situation where imagine Facebook giving away all of its software and people deciding they want to start up a Facebook competitor and they've got all of Facebook's software. Facebook would still have the dominance by virtue of its network effects and its extracted data. So this is the sort of problem of open source software, is that it's not the only limitation, it's not the only source of power for these companies. Open source is a good thing, of course, but we have to be thinking about the alternative sources of power for these platforms. So I don't hold much hope for platform cooperativism. It's a nice idea, and when it works, it's great, but it's not going to take down Uber, Google, Facebook, or Amazon. So an alternative here is what I call public platforms. So who does have the resources to compete with Uber, Google, Facebook, and Amazon? Well, states do. States could take these things over, they could run them in the public interest, they could regulate them for the common good, they could turn them into public platforms effectively. The problem is, what about the security state? How do we separate out a sort of state-owned platform from the security state that wants all of that data as well? How do we build up firewalls between them? I'm not even sure it's technically feasible, but I don't think it'd be politically possible either. So I think the idea of sort of getting states to develop and own and regulate and nationalize platforms, I think has huge problems associated with it as well. Again, it's a nice sort of idea, but I think there's just massive limits to it. So this is sort of where I'm led to. I'm led to a likely scenario of monopoly platforms that doesn't look too good for us, and I'm led to two sort of alternative solutions that don't seem like they would work or may even be worse than monopoly platforms. And I have to admit that my book ends on a rather negative note. I'm not sure where to go from here, and if anybody has ideas, that'd be fantastic. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.